Before we get into what to eat, it's important to go over why what you eat matters, because it actually is one of the most important parts of taming type 1. That's why I have it first. You may have been told by a doctor or a specialist that you can eat whatever you want as long as you take insulin. And in a way, this is accurate. You can do whatever you want. You can't eat Cheetos and chocolate cake and have a heart attack when you're 30. You can strip off your clothes and run around butt naked on the street if you want to. You can do a lot of things. Doesn't mean you should. If you follow that terrible advice of just eating whatever you want and taking insulin for it, then your management's going to suffer. Your blood sugar is going to be on a roller coaster. You'll have a very tough time of controlling your diabetes, and you'll never truly be able to tame type 1. But why is this? Why does what you eat matter? Well, think about it. Let's say you have a typical meal. So you have some pasta, or you go to McDonald's and have fries and a chicken sandwich with a Diet Coke, of course, because you're cutting back on sugar, right? Let's say you eat a typical meal and you count your carbs, you take whatever insulin you calculate for it. What happens? Well, if it's anything like my 11 years following the whatever you want to eat approach, then what happens next isn't good. Your blood sugar very rarely ends up where you want it to be. Instead of ending up between 80 to 120, where you really want it to be, your blood sugar ends up way too high or way too low, and you need to correct for that. And when you correct for that, if you correct from way too high, it ends up way too low. If you correct from way too low, it ends up way too high, and you end up on this vicious cycle. Your blood sugar keeps going up and down, over and over, every single day, forever. And it's a mess. It's very rare. For me, at least, it was very rare to ever see a blood sugar that was within normal range, even for just a little bit. I consider this a unicorn. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can get off that roller coaster, and it starts by simply changing what you eat. Instead of eating just anything, you want to instead avoid the foods that are causing this to happen. What do I mean by that? Well, certain foods, like probably many of the foods you eat right now, will spike your blood sugar, like that pasta or those french fries. They'll spike your blood sugar very fast because they're full of carbs. There are tons of fast-acting carbs in these typical meals. And what that does is, no matter what carb it is, by the way, it can be from bread, potatoes, sugar, it all turns into sugar very quickly in the bloodstream and all spikes your blood sugar very fast. So what do? You take insulin for it, right? You take a ton of insulin to match a ton of carbs. And in theory, this should work. But in practice, it doesn't. Because what you're trying to really do here is match a very high peak with another very high peak, as in you're trying to match a very high and very fast spike from sugar with a very high amount of very fast-acting insulin. And when you try to match these two peaks, you try to time it right, it never works. You can never truly match them. And so you end up either going way too high or you end up going way too low. And you have to correct that, and you have to correct that, and you have to correct that, and over and over and over. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. But it turns out you actually don't need to eat all those high carb foods that cause your blood sugar to spike so much. You can actually instead eat foods that don't spike your blood sugar as much. And then you won't need as much insulin. And then, since you're not using as much insulin, and you're not eating as much carbs, your blood sugar won't spike as high, and it won't drop too low. That is called the law of small numbers, which is a term coined by Dr. Bernstein, who has been doing the kind of approach I advocate for as a type 1 diabetic for decades and decades and decades. Law of small numbers, meaning small numbers mean small chances of small mistakes. Consequently, big numbers mean big chances of big mistakes. To put it another way, high carb meals mean you have a high chance of going too high or too low because you're trying to match two very high peaks with each other and it just doesn't work. Whereas low amount of carbs means a lower chance of mistakes, means lower chances of highs, lower chances of low, and a much higher chance of staying within range, which is what you want. Instead of your blood sugar being like a bunch of mountain peaks, jagged, going high all the time, going low all the time. Instead, you could have your blood sugar more like a rolling hill, where it maybe goes up a little bit and goes down a little bit, much more stable. And if once you truly master diabetes, which you can once you get through this whole series and know all the techniques it takes to tame type 1, you might even be able to find yourself a flat line. That is what you can get out of simply changing what you eat, and of course following the other techniques as well. And guess what? Not only do you not need those carbs at all, but it's actually really easy to cut them out. For example, let's say instead of having pasta for dinner, you can have just chicken and some salad. Easy fix, and it's still going to be delicious. But big difference is instead of having 100 carbs and 10 units of insulin, let's say, you'll be just be having 10 carbs and a lot less insulin. Now you still have to bolus for the protein, the chicken, and I'll get into another video, but what's going to happen since you're having much less carbs than the previous meal, instead of having two huge peaks that you're trying to match, you're going to have much smaller peaks. It's going to be much easier for those to align. And when those two peaks do align, suddenly your blood sugar, instead of going like this and this and this, it's going to be just going up a little bit, maybe down a little bit. And maybe if you can truly tame type 1, which you can through all these videos, it'll even be a flat line. That's what is possible. When you cut back on the carbs, you cut back on the spikes. When you cut back from that, you're also cutting back from the insulin you need to bring it back down. So you're cutting back from the spikes, you're cutting back from the dips, and when you cut back from those two things, you also cut back from all the corrections you need when it goes too high or too low. What does that mean? That means your blood sugar is going to be much more predictable. It's going to be at a much higher chance of staying in range. And that is exactly what you're going for when you manage diabetes, which is why cutting back on those carbs is so important. You cut back on the spikes, you cut back on the corrections, and you cut back on the worries. So that is why eating matters. That's why what you eat matters, and that's why it's important to eat low carb. Next, we'll go over what foods should you eat that won't spike your blood sugar so much and that will allow you to tame type 1. And after that, we'll go over what foods shouldn't you eat. That's all for now. Stay tuned and learn how you can tame your type 1.